Contra is back. Sort of. Besides the announcement of that one film, which I'm pretty sure got cancelled, we haven't seen any official activity on the Contra franchise in more than 5 years. Until now. After the debacle between Konami and Hideo Kojima back in 2015, people assumed the company was completely done making video games in general, despite never claiming that. I think this belief was pushed further when Konami emphasized they became the driving force to support legalized gambling in Japan, as well as wanting to prioritize mobile games that were making them pretty insane amounts of coin at the time. Probably still are, but you know. In fact, the heads of the company stated in a recent article that they still see console gaming as an important aspect. Not that I necessarily want to defend them, seeing some of these patchy slot machines is still upsetting. While Konami developing original console games has become sparse during the 8th generation, recently they've made an effort to porting or even remastering their titles for more current platforms, such as Zone of the Enders 2, various Castlevania games, and of course the classic era of the Contra series. Good stuff! Now, how about we get some of those old Silent Hill games properly ported onto newer platforms, huh? Please? With that said, I want to preface this critique with a bit of background on the Contra series and my overall thoughts on this wonderful genre-defining action series. After all, we just saw the release of the Contra Anniversary Collection in June of 2019. To nobody's surprise, it only covers the titles up to Contra Hard Corps for the Sega Genesis, but at least Konami had enough self-awareness to exclude Contra Force, one of the worst games on the original NES. The important part is that people with a PS4, Xbox One, Switch, and PC can now experience some of the best Contra games with a quick download, so that's great. I pray with every bone in my body that this collection sells well enough to merit current-gen remasters of the PlayStation 2 titles, Contra 4, and maybe even Rebirth, but I have a feeling in my gut that won't ever happen. I own all of these titles and can enjoy them whenever I'd like in the comfort of my own abode, but I'd love to recommend them to people who don't have such means and would more readily buy them for a reasonable price in digital storefronts than attempt downloading ROMs or ISOs or what have yous of these titles, which they'll likely not bother doing from my recommendation alone. Anyway, without getting into the nitty and gritty, this collection was very well done. Those M2 boys did it again. But am I really going to talk about these games obsessively like it's 2016 again? Not exactly, but I think it's important to touch on again, as you'll soon see. I have to be honest, I don't like my old retrospective very much. I only began learning how to write properly back then, and I feel like I didn't clearly convey what made these games so memorable to me. I always felt there's two huge aspects to Contra that are very important, one being the gameplay, tight controls that reward players getting the hang of it in order to react to enemy patterns and incoming projectiles. The other being its presentation, the environment, the enemies, the bosses. They typically range between grotesque creatures and horrifying mutations to gigantic brutish industrial mechs. This was something conveyed to an extent in the original NES titles, but went full force once the developers were able to take advantages of the 16-bit consoles with their single entries. Giant beasts and explosive action galore. Outside of those horrid PlayStation 1 titles, these aspects would stay true for the modern entries as well. That was until Hardcore Uprising. This may seem like I'm going on an off-topic tangent, but the whole thing does relate to my critique towards Contra Rogue Corps later on. I still occasionally get comments on that old video about how I'm wrong, dumb, or an asshole because I didn't enjoy Hardcore Uprising. Perhaps how I discussed it in the video wasn't the best way to describe my gripes with the game. Here you've got sprinting, dashing, air dashing, double jump that can be followed by air dashing, a permanent upgrade system, these weird moves and dodges that cause things to explode, bullet reflect, and a goddamn health bar. Also, all big enemies and bosses have health bars. Pop quiz, what do all these things have in common? Quick answer, they do not belong in Contra. Oh, Ghenry, you were so young and foolish. Just 3 years ago. It feels like I was mere steps away from obnoxiously shouting, "Betrayal!"
What?
Betrayal! Betrayed me! Don't get me wrong, I'm not denouncing any part of that retrospective. While I sound immature and overdramatic in this video, I still stand by just about everything I said. The game has boring enemy patterns, the sound design is terrible and even unbalanced at times, the pace feels poor, possibly why there was a sprint button included in the first place, and the visuals are absolutely repugnant. Honestly, this was the biggest gut punch for me when it came to the game. I like Arc Systems. They've made cool and gorgeous games, so I was really looking forward to this. I wanted to love it. But it just wasn't possible. The 3D models look so lazily designed, and don't give me any of that budget downloadable title hooey. Contra Rebirth, another budget downloadable Contra game on an even weaker system, looks much better than this. Who made this great little WiiWare title anyway? Oh, it was them too. Perhaps if ArcSys just went with a 2D style for everything and not just the main characters and smaller enemies. Although heavily detailed HD sprites are nothing to shake a stick at, money-wise. I already know the practice nearly put SNK out of business indefinitely. But even Contra games entirely rendered in 3D were able to provide wonderful visuals and amazing enemy designs. Nearly every single Contra boss in the past 8 games have this intense and brutal presence to them. These big, disgusting monsters and hulking hard-body mechas? Come on, where's the absurd nature of these supposed alien armies? There's nothing wrong with straying away from the established style if the change is good. Plenty of things changed between a lot of the Contra games, but the enemy design still had this deformed aura surrounding it. Can anyone really say these bosses in Hardcore Uprising that look like Mega Blocks are an improvement over the previous games? Well, maybe the crappy PS1 titles. But enough about all that. Let's talk about something I thought was completely fine, the controls. It doesn't feel bad to play, not really. While I've never been silent about my disdain with the mechanics, the controls themselves are pretty much what a Contra game should play like. They even included the aim lock that lets you move freely while keeping the gun at a fixed angle, something that started with Shattered Soldier and honestly should be a standard feature for any run-and-gun game, but instead it's completely absent in all of them. My gripe was never with this, but rather the bullshit surrounding it, like the sprint ability, that countering shit, the game's overall boring stages along with terrible, terrible enemy design. It's kinda the same problem I had with Strider 2014. The controls are great, but the design and presentation were so bland and unimpressive that I couldn't enjoy what that game offered in the slightest. It doesn't really matter anymore though. Daisuke went back to making Guilty Gear games, so all is well. Keep doing what you're doing, over there, away from me and my Contra games. So, I've expressed my issues with this game that controls fine for a Contra game, but the visual style is completely lacking and disheartening. What if I were to play a Contra game that has that extreme, gross, 90s loving style, but this time the gameplay and design were completely different? A flip of the script. Enter Contra Rogue Corps. I saw that it was isometric and thought, oh, maybe it'll be like Neo Contra, and I love that game, but hands-on demo videos started coming up, and that's when I saw it was certainly not going to be like that. But you know what I did like from the trailer? The disgusting creatures, giant robots, and colorful cast of playable characters who felt appropriate for what that game's style and aesthetic were going for, so I thought the game would at least be a fun visual experience I can blow through in a few hours and give my piece. That was until they started revealing more and more, and I felt like something particular was going on with this game's production. But I'll talk more about that once I get into the overall design. What I aim to do with this video is give a very honest critique on the game. I want to explain what works and what doesn't in Contra Rogue Corps with an open-minded approach. I might get biased here and there, but I think it's important to see how a Contra veteran such as myself took in everything. I feel inclined to do this because I couldn't help but notice that the bigger content creators out there taking pot shots at Contra Rogue Corps are going about it in a way I can only call lazy. But there's no real need to get into that. If you want to see a bunch of people just rant aimlessly over a game not being exactly like the original Contra, or in other cases simply existing, go ahead and try to watch one of these videos. If you want to see someone trying to be a little more open-minded on the game, then simply keep watching as we dive into Contra Rogue Corps. Developed within Konami's studio of Japan with assistance from Toy Logic, and this whole project is spearheaded by Nobuya Nakazato. His name might not be iconic to most people, but trust me when I say he's no Randy. This man was the sole director of Contra 3, Contra Hardcore, and Contra Shattered Soldier. Literally my top 3 favorite Contra games in the franchise. I know Nakazato wasn't responsible for every single aspect of what made those games so great, but he has spoken much about development regarding those games and how it was his intent to make them full of over-the-top ridiculous action. At least according to this new interview found in the Contra Anniversary Collection. Anyway, we've got a guy on board who definitely has a good idea of what made this run-and-gun franchise so awesome, right? So that begs the question, how was this new title designed? It's an isometric action game that actually moves kinda slow. There's a lot of RPG elements like leveling up weapons, customizing your loadout, collecting money from fallen enemies, upgrading yourself, and even gambling in-game money to take on randomized challenges. Oh, and don't forget the grinding. There's lots of grinding. I'm used to a new Contra game taking me a long time to finish, but not because it expects me to level up and max out some weapons and abilities. This is something that started to rear its head in Hardcore Uprising with its in-game store just to add crutches for the player, but now it's a huge and essential part of the game if you have any hope to finish it. This is probably the first Contra game you can't actually speed through in under an hour. Just getting by with the bare minimum of understanding all these elements, it took me over 50 hours of playing just to clear the main campaign. The structure of this game is very strange. At first it seems pretty basic. You get a mission rank, and for the first set you notice they're all in a freshly ruined city. That's all well and good, you fight a big boss at the end, and then the second set comes in and you notice the venue is completely different. Overgrown plants across an abandoned town. You think, alright, so each mission rank set is a different venue, which is fine until you discover that this set starts reusing venues from the previous mission rank. And it kinda just keeps randomly throwing new scenery as you clear more stages. You might also notice that these gates you bust open are basically just loading screens in disguise. They even start borrowing assets and exact layouts for their own set of missions. But what does the game play like? How does it feel controlling your soldier in the midst of these alien freaks? It's fine for the most part. However, it feels like there's this slight input delay when it comes to controller responsiveness. I believe people even addressed this when the demo came out as well. That's probably the biggest fault in the game's controls. Thankfully, this input problem was fixed, like 2 months and 3 updates later. Otherwise, it's serviceable for a twin-stick shooter. If it controlled exactly like Neo Contra with the same pace, I'd be much more excited for this. But it's noticeably more sluggish, and there's no way to fix that angle of your gun, like in Neo Contra. Aim assist is something I normally avoid, but for this it feels a bit necessary, especially because the game likes to obscure your line of sight too often, as well as have enemies out of frame. What can I tell you, they're not giving me much of a choice. Also, something detrimental to PC players, keyboard and mouse is not an option. At all. Considering how many top-down action games are on PC with perfectly fine keyboard and mouse controls, this is nothing short of baffling. The game just likes to keep throwing more and more hordes of enemies at you. It's easy to compare this to games like Smash TV or Total Carnage. The game even occasionally locks you in a room so you can't progress until you've wiped out everyone in your immediate area. Obviously, Contra games past the NES era like to overwhelm the player from time to time, but the weight of fighting these oncoming foes along with keeping an eye on your own character while taking on some platforming challenges is what made those games so insanely intense and gratifying when you clear a section perfectly. With a game like this, it's usually more about crowd control and sometimes watching your step, which, I mean, it's okay. It's playable, but it's not Contra. Sometimes the game feels like Neo Contra, mostly when it comes to the bosses. They like to throw some bits of bullet hell here and there, which I enjoy, except where it feels like they're just cheating. If I didn't have a weapon that ricocheted, how else could I have killed these things without taking damage? These are the kind of moments where I can definitely have some fun, but for the most part, the game likes to throw hunks and hunks of meat that will likely take a lot of time to tear down because your gun isn't strong enough. Besides the 2 guns you choose for your loadout, there's also rare weapon pickups you can find in the middle of the stage. You can also do finishing moves against a single type of enemy. That's weird. You guys did this whole character animation just for one type of enemy that scarcely pops up. It helps when you're in a pinch and low on health though. There's the dodge that also works like a lunging melee attack. Like the slide kick in Contra Hardcore, you're invulnerable during this animation. It doesn't do a lot of damage, but can help you get away from serious trouble and has a chance to daze enemies. When they're in a daze, you can pick them up to chuck them away or into other enemies. This can also help when you're swarmed, but it's really hard to tell when you're invulnerable during the action. Slap on some temporary abilities that are unique to each character and you're ready to take on the armies of zombos, babyface things, beasts of terror, and other nasty villains. Over and over and over again. Alright, so let's go over the positives, things I enjoyed from this game. I like the visuals a lot. Sure, the graphics are undeniably rough, it's clearly a budget title, but the artistry is just about where I want the Contra games to be. Contra 3 really started showing off the monstrosities of the Red Falcon alien army, but they went full force with their grotesque nature in the PS2 games. Contra Rogue Corps looks like it finds a pretty perfect middle ground between the mindsets in regards to the artistry, which seems perfect since I'm pretty sure this occurs somewhere between Contra 3 and Shattered Soldier. Oh boy, are we really going to talk about lore in a Contra game? Yeah, I guess so. Konami even put out an official canonical timeline, as you could see in the Anniversary Collection's extras. Isn't this timeline neat? Oh, what's that? Hardcore Uprising isn't part of the canonical timeline? What? Not even a spin-off blip on the top right? Gee, that's funny. I guess any Contra wiki pages out there should just remove all the articles talking about Hardcore Uprising. You know, since it isn't officially on the Contra timeline according to the people in charge of the series. The story and characters were written by Sarah Dyer and Evan Dorkin, writers for various TV shows and comics such as Space Ghost Coast to Coast, the Superman animated series, Eltingville, and Call of Cthulhu. While the two have been in the comic book industry for plenty of years, I wouldn't call them big names. Why on earth Konami, a company based in Japan, got two American East Coast comic creators to do the story for a new Contra game is still something I don't know. For now. Anyway, they wrote the scenes, dialogue, and even designed the characters. Contra never had a strong story in the slightest, so the motion comic scenes were a nice touch, again adding to the 90s style and aesthetic. These hired guns aren't the most original depictions of offbeat anti-heroes, but they were pretty entertaining in their own right.
Oh, allow me to translate. My dear friend is asking if you are the scion of the owner of this delightful chop shop. Comrades, we have procured our target.
Honestly, the only time a Contra game's character spoke full sentences before, it was pretty flavorless.
You're Riser. Bill Riser?
Yeah, and you are?
Well now. Let's just say Mystery G.
Mystery G?
So I see any kind of change as an improvement, especially one that leaned towards the unapologetically violent nature of yesteryear's visceral entertainment. I just wish there was some kind of in-game banter going on. It would encourage replays as different characters as well, maybe even during co-op play, kinda like Left 4 Dead.
Hey, Whispering Oaks. Shit, I used to go there when I was a kid.
Oh good, now we can die there as adults.
I like the ridiculous nature of all the enemies too. The zombie fodder smacking the screen is funny, albeit lingers a bit too long. The more organic abominations are pretty cool to see for the first time, but the glamour definitely fades when you're forced to fight them over and over and over again, with little more than palette swaps changing the experience. Also, the helicopter boss sucks. He's the worst thing in this entire game. As soon as you see that trail come down, you already know you're in for an awful time. Still, I really enjoyed a lot of the larger enemy designs, especially the main bosses. Even in the midst of everything they changed that went against the classic Contra experience, the bosses are still the best part of the entire game. How about that? I think the way the game plays is mostly fine. Anyone that thinks the game controls just as bad as Contra Legacy of War didn't play that game, this one, or is just being needlessly overdramatic. Look no further than the fact that Legacy of War was unable to take advantage of the PlayStation's analog sticks. Obviously, Rogue Corps was able to, and for an isometric shooter, that makes designing the controls pretty simple to get right, which in Contra Rogue Corps it feels mostly right. The overheating mechanics seem to receive the brunt of criticism. I understand the notion though. Contra defined the run and gun genre. Often you run and gun without stop. In Contra Rogue Corps, it's more like you run and gun in moderation. This was giving me trouble at first, but I was able to pair my machine gun with a pretty powerful sub-weapon that overheated quickly, but if I time the swap perfectly, I can keep firing without having to stop. It takes some time to get used to this, but it's still just part of the game's mechanics that I was able to understand and make it a non-issue. I don't mind needing to cool down my one gun as long as my other gun can protect me just as well. This comes down to finding that perfect companion piece. I can see see why they opted for the overheat function, since it encouraged you to try different kinds of weapons and mix up the strategy, rather than holding down a single button the entire time. This wouldn't be right for any other Contra game, I would think, but it makes sense for how Rogue Corps was designed, at least in my opinion. Speaking of weapons, I'm surprised just how many there are in this game. It's probably the biggest assortment of guns since Neo Contra. Not all weapons are ideal for every single stage though. I stuck with the machine gun since it seems to be the best all-around weapon, but it's been really interesting trying all of them throughout my experience. Also, after a long time grinding my weapons to efficiency, I discovered the extent of the game's exploration mode, which is an assortment of missions that plays by a different set of rules than the main campaign. The area selection and enemy spawns are procedurally generated and also depend on what difficulty you chose. I actually like these stages a lot, since there's a semblance of risk put into the missions, and it comes with a high reward if you manage to clear the whole thing. It also has the courtesy of providing experience to the characters you aren't playing as once you clear them, so it helps if I want to use the rest of the cast in later stages. Playing this mode as much as I did also helped me realize how this game was designed. The layout for the main campaign's missions never changed, but everything feels picked apart and slightly randomized for its structure. For the exploration mode, it uses all of those assets to do just that, but the missions are never the same due to how nearly everything is randomized with a new run. Okay, so there's some stuff to like. I always wanted to be clear on that. I love the extreme 90s vibe of the game, I love those big gross monsters, I like some of the game's design and mechanics, and the exploration mode is pretty enjoyable once you build a decent arsenal. I feel like if this whole thing was brought into different contexts, it would have been received much better in gaming communities. One obvious way would be making it feel like some of the other Contra games. I mean, sure, I don't like playing Hardcore Uprising, but I can't deny that it plays like a Contra game, especially if you ignore the bullshit extra abilities like I do. It's a Contra title I don't like, but that doesn't mean it's not a Contra title. My anger towards Hardcore Uprising going against the series established isn't really there anymore. I still hate playing that game, but it's a calmer, passive sense of hatred. If Hardcore Uprising were a person and I were to pass by them back in 2011, I would have taken the opportunity to spit in their face. Now, I would just walk past them and pretend they're not there. It's that kind of hatred now, you know? Honestly, the problems I have with Contra Rogue Corps are not exactly like my problems with Hardcore Uprising, but it's the same ballpark. Just like a lot of the design that was put into Hardcore Uprising didn't sit well with me as a Contra fan, the same can be said about Rogue Corps, and perhaps to a greater degree. The various RPG elements, the incessant demand that I grind the same stages over and over again, the lame-ass customization options, and can we talk about that for a second? Seriously, fuck these kinds of upgrades. They are in countless games these days, and I'm so tired of seeing it. Yeah, wow, I paid a shitload of money for this organ transplant. Now Kaiser's weapon switching is 0.3 seconds faster, or the negation rate is 5% higher. Whatever that means. Amazing. That's really going to change how I play this game. Spending an insane amount of in-game currency for a weapon upgrade that increases the firing rate by like 2%? Are you kidding? This isn't fun to grind for, and the difference is barely noticeable. I get it though, I get it. You turn Contra into this linear dungeon crawler-ish kind of game where you grind for experience, kill enemies for money, and get stronger so you can beat the time stages. That's right, even if you manage to get through the stages without dying, the game won't let you clear them if your weapons aren't strong enough. Another way for them to make sure you don't just force yourself through these brick walls. This is so ridiculous. I'm surprised the game is completely free of microtransactions. Perhaps when the entire gaming community told them to go hump themselves after it was shoehorned into Metal Gear Solid 5 and the Survive spinoff, they must have decided it wasn't worth the trouble. That didn't stop them from adding a season pass though, oddly enough. I can't say the music is very exciting. That's definitely worth bringing up because I feel like Contra games always manage to have some memorable tunes for pretty much its entire franchise. It usually does a great job getting you enthralled while taking on the evil alien army that lay ahead of you. For Contra Rogue Corps, some of it sounds pretty good, but other songs are incredibly boring. They also cue in the more noticeable songs once you enter these gauntlets. Weird little gimmick, especially considering very few portions of the game are without enemies. I like this track a lot. Not sure why. Here's a few bits of criticism that won't really fit anywhere else. Why the hell can't I pause? I can't pause the game. I know there's games like the Souls series and Monster Hunter that also don't let you pause at any point, and there's probably a discussion to be had about why and what those games implement in regards to online capabilities, especially Souls. But for Rogue Corps, what reason could it have to never allow pausing at all? There's no character spirits wandering around the stage, and for something that demands I grind as much as this game does, I like to throw on something to keep myself entertained while I continue to run through the same stages over and over again. I gotta hit the I'm still here confirmation on Netflix in between finishing move animations. It's ridiculous, I tells ya. After hours of playing, I realized there is a means to pause mid-stage. Basically these gates that transition you to the next stage. If you stay in there without shooting the door open, enemies can't hurt you and the timer actually stops. That's nice. Wish something in the game's tutorial told me that. 3 patches deep and the pause button still won't pause the game, so I assume it just won't ever happen. I'm not crazy about the shooting gallery mode that pops up from time to time. I see that they were trying to recreate the third-person scenarios from the original Contra, but dragging around the cursor isn't very intuitive, especially since my reticle moves with the camera. Trying to make sense of how aiming works with this is disorienting to say the least. I discussed the multiplayer modes, but the most I was ever able to do was some online co-op with a friend who wasn't enjoying the game at all. Contra Rogue Corps has some versus modes for up to 8 players, but even at launch, I was shit out of luck trying to gather that number of people through endless searching. Ultimately, the grinding aspect is the biggest fault in this game's design, and it would be the one that would turn many people away from the full experience if they didn't already despise nearly everything else about the game. It's got some great visuals and monster designs, I like the over-the-top sequences and animations, and the story itself was fun to witness. But still, so many things leave me to question, why? Why make it like this? Contra Rogue Corps was not designed like a run-and-gun side-scrolling shooter, you know, like nearly every game in the franchise has been for the past 30-something years. Instead, it's this isometric RPG shoot-and-loot hybrid. Is this what Nakazata wanted? The man behind the absolute greatest games in the franchise? He's been in various interviews and talked about how he's been trying to get a new Contra game off the ground for years. By the way, that mysterious 2011 trailer? Yeah, he was part of that project. Anyway, the important thing to note isn't that he wanted to make a new Contra game for years, but it's that Konami didn't. I have a small theory, and it's probably not hard to consider the reality of this situation, seeing as this is Konami we're talking about. So, a quick story. Konami has been in charge of a series called Silent Hill since its creation back in 1999, 8 games in the span of 12 years. It was cemented as a single-player survival horror series, okay? Love or hate these games, this isn't the time to get into that, they were basically all survival horror games. So the 9th game in was a spin-off on the PS Vita called Silent Hill Book of Memories, and it was also an RPG dungeon crawler with some loot elements along with a focus on multiplayer and all kinds of mechanics that were never in the previous games. What's the first thing that comes to mind after hearing about this? A simple why. Now, I don't want to discredit a game just because it's a spin-off doing its own thing, especially when it's in the prosper of upcoming installments that look more faithful. Spin-offs trying to be something much different are not offensive in their own right, and my bias aside, at least the company and developers involved made what they considered a faithful entry to the series months before this bizarre PS Vita game. Even so, why would they do this? Well, the truth is that the developers didn't want to at first. Producer Tom Hewlett and director Adam Tierney discuss how the job of a Silent Hill Vita game fell onto the laps from the Konami spout, complete with particular instructions. In an interview, Adam Tierney stated, WayForward was brought in after Konami had solidified the broad strokes of the game, which was to be multiplayer, feature RPG stats, and take place in an endless dungeon crawler style randomized environment. The idea was to create a Silent Hill game that friends could play together with enough content to last potentially months of gaming, while still offering handheld appropriate bite-sized play sessions. It's starting to make sense, right? The likes of Tom Hewlett and Adam Tierney marketed the game extensively, doing various interviews talking about how they did their best trying to make it an enjoyable and scary game so that they can live up to the rest of the Silent Hill series. Whether or not they misunderstood the original aspects is beside the point. They never really spoke further on the fact that Konami literally went to them and demanded it to be a multiplayer-focused dungeon crawler with RPG elements and have some sort of endless mode. Basically, the likes of WayForward were trying to make a faithful game to a franchise that had no business being forced into this position. Now, I don't really have any evidence that this is the exact same case for Contra, but doesn't it sound plausible that Nakazato was given the same kind of order? Of course, not a lick of this comes up within interviews, so I still don't have much ground with my argument. However, sources have stated that Konami's scrutiny has ramped up ever since the Kojima debacle from a few years back. If you'd like to know more about that debacle, I recommend checking out the Great Debates video on it through the link below. But the skinny of it is, that occurrence led Konami to start monitoring and tracking down basically everything their employees do and say, according to sources. To the point where you get reprimanded for saying something a monitoring officer doesn't like, and I'm sure that includes anything that could potentially make the company look bad. I don't think it's a stretch to say that Konami didn't want to fund even a budget-level retail game that can be beaten as quickly as the truest Contra titles. Charging $30 to $40 for a physical copy of a game so simplistic, short, and fast-paced? What is this, the early 2000s? Sure, Nakazato did a bunch of interviews and says he thinks this new title proudly carries the spirit of Contra and believes friends and families will have much quick fun with it and all that jazz. But reading a lot of these back-to-back, it feels formulaic. Who's to say Nakazato wasn't accompanied by someone out of frame listening to every word, making sure he didn't say something that even remotely implied this whole game wasn't his idea, but something the upper level executives requested? They haven't attempted to make a console-based Contra game in 8 years, so why on earth would they want this to be the grand return of the series? But maybe I'm jumping the gun with this situation. Maybe Nakazato wanted to make a Contra game like this. Maybe the man behind some of the greatest, most chaotic and actiony run-and-gun games of all time thought Contra would be a good fit for a slow, dungeon-crawling, isometric RPG shooter. You understand my doubt on that posit though, right? I'm trying to be as open-minded as I can, but even I don't think a lot of his claims about how they designed this game line up right. So, what's my ultimate take on Contra Rogue Corps? We've discussed the aspects I think work well, some that just don't fit Contra, and others that frankly aren't aspects I enjoy very much as someone that likes action games. Is this the worst game ever made? No. Is it the worst title in the Contra series? No. It might be kinda close, but I can say wholeheartedly that the series has seen worse. The ultimate feeling I had playing through this was underwhelmed. I mean, I guess that's better than the absolute disdain and depression I feel when playing Hardcore Uprising. That counts for something, right? When a game doesn't unintentionally make me feel depressed. I wanted to give this a really fair shake. I didn't want to just immediately discredit it after a demo feeling different from the previous games. Why wouldn't I want to see if a new Contra game is good, despite how odd it appears at the surface? Still, that doesn't absolve the game from the numerous problems it has. I just think people got really overdramatic when talking about this whole thing. It's just like what happened with Metal Gear Survive. It isn't a great game, but is it some unplayable piece of shit? Most would tell you yes, and I'd wager the majority of people claiming such never even touched it. I guess what I'm trying to get at is a subpar modern Konami game is now the equivalent to most companies releasing an unplayable piece of trash, and I reject that notion. Everyone is free to hate the company all they want, that's their prerogative, and I'm not a fan of theirs either. I just think tearing down the people involved in the actual development don't deserve to get this kind of hatred spit at them when they never really did anything wrong. From the looks of it, Konami will not be likely to give Contra another shot after this blunder. This seemed like a game they weren't confident to release in the first place, and wouldn't have bothered if it wasn't for Nakazato's persistence. One last thing, I'm sure some people are wondering, why didn't they just make a budget title like classic Contra? Cuphead did so well, and that game is definitely part of the run and gun genre. I'm going to be completely honest here. I love Cuphead. It was a great run and gun experience for the most part, but the core gameplay is the last reason it sold as well as it did. People were enthralled by the art style and its wonderful visuals combined with traditional animation and incredible music. Just about all of the accolades it received were due to the game's presentation, not the fact that it was a well-designed run-and-gun game. Meanwhile, you look at games like Super Cyborg and Blazing Chrome. They're both pretty good games and take much more from the Contra formula, but neither of them made any real waves at all upon their release. It's possible that this is why Konami doesn't see something like Contra being a rousing success anymore, so they wanted the new game to go for a completely different style than the rest of the franchise. Contra Rogue Corps tried to have some depth, but it just misfires with a lot of its concepts and only feels extremely tedious, especially when playing it by yourself. I think back to how long it took me to get good at a bunch of the Contra games, learning enemy patterns and understanding what I can memorize and what relies on my reflexes. I believe the fighting game lingo considers this labbing, in which you're not actually working to make progress in the game, but taking the time to understand parts of it better in order to hone the skills you need to beat it. Contra Rogue Corps' biggest fault is probably the fact that they replaced the labbing of the game design with just plain old grinding, so it's something I just can't get behind. If you want to play a game with similar design but with more rogue elements in mind, then I suggest you play Enter the Gungeon. If you want to play games that feel like successors doing their best to carry the run and gun legacy Contra initially died with, then I suggest you play Cuphead, Blazing Chrome, or Super Cyborg. If you want some of the best gaming goodness the official Contra series has to offer and don't mind giving Konami some scratch with a tiny ray of hope they might receive the message that people still want classic run and gun games, then I suggest you buy the Contra Anniversary Collection. If you're morbidly curious of this bizarre-looking title with questionable game design and have a collection of Contra games that you might as well make slightly more complete, then I guess you can give Contra Rogue Corps a try. Just don't say I didn't warn you. Thanks for watching.